You can see that the pointing in the Indian stone paving has started to crumble and come away in quite a few places, like here. In some places it's still quite solid, there's no crumbling at all, but lots of places there are broken up cement. So the first thing we need to do is clear all that broken cement out, and if you want to get a good colour match, you're going to have to clear out the good cement as well, to fill it all at the same time with the same sort of mortar. Here's an area of the paving where I've already dug out a lot of the mortar, so you can see the mortar joints are nice and clean, and I've swept them, but I'll give them another sweep before I start to refill them. But you need to dig them out and completely clean them down the sides, and dig them out to about 4 or 5 centimeters deep. These are the various tools that I've been using to remove all the old cement. So there's lump hammers and the standard sort of cold chisels. I did have a go with the 9-inch stone bladed angle grinder, but that creates an awful lot of mess, so I really haven't used that much. My most useful tool has been this hammer drill, and that's been really good, especially where the cement has still been really hard. And then once it's broken up, I just use this sort of little weed rake thing here and the brush to brush it all out. And once everything's really clean, I then get my leaf blower and brush all the final bits of dust and leaves out, and that way you've got nice clean joints to refill. For the pointing mortar, I'm using a dry mix, and I'm doing it in 2 parts sharp sand, 2 parts building sand, and 1 part standard general purpose cement. I'm just mixing in this bucket here, and then mixing it until all the colour is completely uniform, and then you know you've got a good mix. But I'm only mixing small amounts at a time because it is quite warm, dry weather, and I don't want it to sort of get too dry. Right, so mortar up. I'm just using a small plant pot as a measure, and that helps me keep it all even. So I'll fill up this plant pot, and I'll do 2 full pots of the sharp sand. So that's my 4 parts sand. And 1 part cement. Right, so now I've got the ingredients in the bucket. You can see there's lots of different colours in there at the moment. You've got reds and yellows and greys. So you're just going to mix it around and get it all nice and even. So it takes a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes to mix it up properly, but you want to make sure you get it really thoroughly mixed so it's a good even colour. There's no lumps of dry cement or anything, it's nice and even. And then you just want to check it, get a handful and just squeeze it together, and if it clumps like that, that's fine, there's enough moisture in there, and then you should squeeze it harder and it'll just start to crumble. But that's a good way. So it's a dry mix, but it's actually a slightly damp mix. If it's too dry and too crumbly, you might need to add a slight dash of water, but the idea is you keep it pretty dry really. So that's now ready to go and start putting into the joints. Right, so this is where I got up to with the filling in the other day. So I'm now going to carry on here. So all these joints I've just freshly blown out with the leaf blower, so they're nice and clean, no dust, no leaves, nothing in there. So I just get in my mortar, the dry mix, and just run it into the joints. a little bit of mortar in there, and then press it in as firmly as you possibly can with your fingers. If the joints on the flags are too narrow to get your fingers into, you may have to use some different tool, maybe a cold chisel or something that you can actually get into the joints and really compress the mixture as much as you possibly can. Really want to be getting that pressed down, and every time I compress it, I then brush some more over the top and compress it more and more and more until it won't compress anymore. Just keep pressing it so you get it level with the top of the flags, but it won't squash down anymore. Then I get out my little pointing trowel, which is, it's got different sort of curvatures on it, but depending on the width of your joints, I get that in there and I really press down on that mortar, really compacting it into the joints as hard as I can. And the benefit of this is you're going to make sure there's no air gaps, no clumps of cement powder in there, and you really need to work it in. And every time you go across a couple of times, compact it in, brush some more dry mix over the top and give it another press down until you can't compress it any further. And ideally it should be just about level with the flags, or very slightly below, just by the sort of level of your trowel. So that should be enough now. Let's do one last press down, and once you've done that, you then just get a brush and come diagonally across the joint and sweep the spare mortar into the next joint that you're going to fill. And once you've brushed over it, one final press, and then I usually just finish off with my thumbs and give it a little brush again. And then just carry on doing that. You just sweep the mortar in, get a little bit more on your trowel and compress it into the joints. Really squeezing it down, brushing more mortar in as you squeeze it down. Brushing it over, getting your trowel, compacting it, a bit more brushing over, compacting it. And it really is important to get this pressed and compacted as hard as you can. It'll give you a much more stable joint, much more weather resistance, and less likely to crumble and crack in the future. So it's worth taking the time and the effort to put that pressure on there. Also, using dry mix, you're much less likely to get any staining on the flags, because once you've put that dry mix in, you just sweep any excess away, so it keeps the flags nice and clean. You need to try and make sure you've got good weather when you're doing this, because you need to keep that dry mix dry, not just while you're putting it into the joints, but also for the next day or so. So if there's any likelihood of any rain, you're best off working in small areas and getting a tarpaulin to cover the surface, just to stop getting any rain in there, because if the mortar gets too wet, if it gets rained on, you'll end up with a crust forming on the top of the mortar and it won't go off properly in the middle, and so it gives you a very unstable mortar, which will then be susceptible to cracking and crumbling. If you're lucky enough to get a couple of dry days after you've finished the job, then on day 3 you can just give a bit of a light spray of water over the top. But the way it works is it uses the moisture from the sand and any moisture from the ground underneath to actually get the cement to go off. But you don't want too much moisture in there to start with. hence the term dry mix. When you've finished doing the pointing, you should have an effect something like this. Give everywhere a gentle brush down, don't brush too hard or you'll brush the pointing out, and then go over it with your leaf blower if you have one to blow all the dust away. And you should have some nice joints. Leave those for a couple of days to dry properly, and then overspray with a fine spray of water, leave it another day, and they should find they're perfectly solid.